Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's fascinating to think about how this video connects people across the world in the same moment, even though we're scattered across different time zones. If you enjoy calm explorations of big ideas, I'd kindly invite you to subscribe. We're aiming for just 10 subscribers right now, and every single one truly matters. And once you've finished here, I hope you'll explore our other videos too. Each one is a journey of curiosity designed to both relax and inspire. Now let's step into today's exploration. Imagine holding a coin in your hand. It seems so ordinary, so familiar, just a small disc of metal. Yet that coin represents one of the most powerful inventions in human history: money. Without it, there would be no cities, no nations, no vast networks of trade. Money is not just an economic tool, but a social technology, a shared belief that allows millions, even billions, of strangers to coordinate their actions. It is, in a sense, the invisible glue holding civilization together. At its core, money is trust. It works because you believe that the person on the other side of a trade also believes in it. Whether it's a paper bill, a digital balance, or a gold coin, money has no real value in itself. It is a promise, a symbol backed by collective faith. The ancient Mesopotamians used clay tablets to track debts. The Chinese once used cowrie shells, and today we swipe cards and watch numbers change on a glowing screen. The form changes, but the essence remains. Money exists because we agree it does. Think about how remarkable that is. Imagine a world where every exchange required bartering. You'd need to find someone who wanted exactly what you had and was willing to trade it for exactly what you wanted. It's inefficient, frustrating, and limited. Money solved that problem by becoming a universal intermediary. You no longer need to exchange goats for wheat. Instead, you trade both for money, which can then buy anything. This single innovation unlocked specialization, long-distance trade, and the rise of complex economies. But there's a deeper science here. Economists and anthropologists often describe money as a kind of social network. Every coin, every note, every digital transfer is a signal pulsing across this network, carrying information about value, trust, and obligation. When millions of people trust the same currency, the network grows strong. When that trust falters, as in times of hyperinflation or economic collapse, the network breaks and society itself trembles. History shows us dramatic examples. In Weimar Germany in the 1920s, inflation was so extreme that workers were paid twice a day, rushing to spend their wages before prices doubled by evening. In Zimbabwe in the 2000s, notes worth trillions were printed, but they couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. In both cases, the breakdown wasn't about paper or printing, it was about belief collapsing. Without faith in money, the intricate machinery of civilization grinds to a halt, and yet money is not just fragile. It is also astonishingly adaptive. It has survived wars, revolutions, and technological upheavals. Today, the rise of cryptocurrencies and digital payment systems shows that money is still evolving. Bitcoin, for example, is sometimes called trustless money because instead of trusting governments or banks, users trust algorithms and cryptographic proofs. Whether or not it lasts, it illustrates the same ancient truth. Money changes form, but it always rests on trust. Here's a curious thought. Money doesn't just shape the outside world, it shapes us. Psychologists have found that even subtle reminders of money can change human behavior. In experiments, people who are shown images of cash or coins before a test often become more self-reliant, less willing to ask for help, and sometimes less generous. Money seems to prime our minds to think in terms of independence and exchange rather than community and sharing. It rewires how we interact with one another, often without us noticing. And on the other side, the absence of money can generate stress so profound it alters cognition itself. Studies show that scarcity, worrying about paying bills or affording food, consumes mental bandwidth. It narrows focus, reduces problem-solving ability, and can even mimic the effects of losing a full night of sleep. Money, or the lack of it, doesn't just affect our wallets. It shapes our thoughts, emotions, and even our capacity to plan for the future. So the next time you hold a coin or glance at your bank balance, remember, you're not just looking at numbers or metal. You're touching one of humanity's most powerful collective inventions. It has built empires and destroyed them, lifted people into comfort, and cast them into despair. It is a mirror of our trust, our ambition, and our fears. In its quiet way, money is as much a force of nature as gravity or time. And that is where our journey begins. With the recognition that money is not simply a tool, but a story, one we tell each other every day, and one that only works as long as we all believe in it. Picture this. Thousands of years ago, before coins, before paper money, before credit cards, people still traded. But how did they do it? If you were a farmer growing grain and you wanted meat, you had to find a herder willing to trade beef for wheat. If you needed pottery, you'd search for a potter who happened to want grain too. This system of bartering worked on a small scale, but as communities grew, it became painfully inefficient. The problem was what economists call the double coincidence of wants. Both parties had to want exactly what the other offered. That's a rare alignment, and it slowed human progress. To solve this, ancient societies began searching for something more universal, something everyone would accept. In Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, people used silver rings and bars as a medium of exchange. They weren't coins yet, but they were standardized enough to represent value. Around the same time, other cultures used barley, salt, or livestock. The Romans later used salt so widely that the word salary comes from salarium, meaning payment in salt. Imagine being paid in bags of salt at the end of your workday. It was valuable because everyone agreed it was. As trade expanded, objects that were durable, portable, and hard to fake became favored. Cowrie shells found across Africa and Asia became one of the most widely used forms of early money. They were naturally uniform, difficult to counterfeit, and easily carried in a pouch. In China, cowries were used for centuries before being replaced by the first true coins. Bronze pieces shaped like knives, spades, or simple discs with holes in the center. These holes allowed merchants to string coins together, carrying wealth like a necklace of value. Why did money take hold so powerfully? Because it allowed specialization. A potter could focus on pottery, a weaver on weaving, a farmer on farming, knowing that their goods could always be exchanged for money, which could then buy anything else. This freed humans from the limitations of barter and created entire economies based on efficiency and growth. The surplus of one person could meet the deficit of another, all mediated by money. But there's another side to this story. Money didn't just enable trade, it enabled measurement. Suddenly, everything could be assigned a value: a sheep, a loaf of bread, a day of labor. This made comparisons possible, but it also shifted how people thought about the world. Things once seen as priceless like trust, loyalty, or even human life began to be measured in coins. Laws in ancient Babylon under Hammurabi's code even set specific fines. So many silver shekels for injury, theft, or loss. With money came the birth of accounting, contracts, and legal systems based on measurable compensation. The leap from barter to currency also transformed relationships between distant cultures. Imagine ancient traders sailing the Mediterranean. Without money, they'd have to exchange goods directly, risking endless negotiations. But with currency, they carried a universal language in their purses. Greek drachmas, Roman denarii, and later, Byzantine solidus coins became recognizable across entire regions, making long-distance trade smoother and safer. Coins carried not just value, but identity, stamped with the faces of rulers and gods. Every coin was both money and propaganda, reminding people who held power. The origins of currency also show us something profound about human psychology. People were willing to agree that certain objects, whether shells or silver, represented value even though their intrinsic worth was limited. Why? Because money is a collective fiction. It works only because we all buy into the same story. This makes it incredibly flexible but also deeply vulnerable. Once the belief collapses, so does the system. Take, for example, the Yapese people of Micronesia, who used massive stone discs called rye stones as money. These stones were so large, sometimes several tons, that they couldn't be moved. Yet ownership could be transferred simply by agreement. A family might say, that stone belongs to them now, even if it stayed in the same spot for generations. The stone's physical presence didn't matter, the shared belief did. This is money in its purest form. Trust crystallized into an object. It is worth pausing to reflect on this. Every coin in your pocket, every note in your wallet, every digital balance on your phone is the descendant of those early shells. Stones and bars of silver, they all tell the same story. The story of human cooperation, imagination, and trust. Without it, our world would still be fractured, local, and small. With it, we became global. The rise of banking and credit, once money, existed in the form of coins and commodities. A new challenge emerged. How do you keep it safe, and how do you make it grow? Carrying wealth in your pouch or hiding it in your home was risky. Thieves, war, and disaster could wipe it out in an instant. Communities needed guardians of wealth, and so the earliest banks were born. The first proto-banks appeared in temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Temples were not only spiritual centers but also trusted places of storage. Farmers deposited grain, merchants left silver, and priests acted as record keepers. These were the beginnings of accounts, ledgers written on clay tablets that recorded deposits and withdrawals. Money was no longer just physical, it was also information. As trade expanded, especially across the Mediterranean, banking matured. In ancient Greece, moneylenders, known as trapezitai, set up tables in marketplaces to exchange coins, offer loans, and facilitate payments. The Romans refined the system further, creating large-scale banks that served both citizens and the empire. They issued loans, kept records, and even transferred funds across provinces. Imagine the sophistication. A merchant in Gaul could deposit money with a banker and have it withdrawn in Rome without carrying a single coin. But banking was not only about safety, it was about leverage. By pooling deposits, bankers could lend out more money than they physically held, relying on the fact that not everyone would demand their deposits back at once. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking, a system that still underpins global finance today. It's both ingenious and dangerous, turning stored wealth into active capital that fuels growth, but also carries the seeds of collapse when trust is shaken. Credit, meanwhile, changed everything. With credit, you didn't need wealth up front to take part in trade or innovation. You could borrow against the future. A farmer could borrow seeds, promising repayment after harvest. A merchant could fund a voyage, gambling that the profits would outweigh the risk. Credit unlocked ambition and expanded horizons, but it also introduced debt, a shadow that could trap families, cities, or even nations. Ancient records are full of debt crises where unpaid loans led to slavery, rebellion, or legal reforms. In Babylon, rulers sometimes declared debt amnesties, wiping slates clean to prevent social collapse. Even then, societies recognized that unchecked debt could destroy the very fabric of their economies. Medieval Europe saw the rise of guilds and merchant banks, with Florence, Venice, and Genoa becoming financial powerhouses. Families like the Medici revolutionized banking, creating networks of branches across cities, issuing letters of credit that acted like early checks. A merchant could travel without carrying coins, relying on written promises honored in distant lands. This system enabled global trade, linking Europe to Asia and Africa, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance economy. What's striking is that banking and credit rely not just on numbers, but on trust. Without faith in the banker, the lender, or the written contract, nothing works. Banking is built on confidence, and history shows us what happens when that confidence breaks. The collapse of Rome, the banking panics of the Middle Ages, or later, the financial crashes of modern times, all trace back to the fragile thread of trust being cut. Science, too, intersects here. Credit is not only an economic tool but also a psychological experiment. Humans are uniquely capable of imagining the future and acting on that imagination. To borrow money is to believe in a tomorrow where you'll be able to repay. To lend money is to believe in someone else's future. Credit is collective optimism quantified, a gamble on human progress. By the time we reached the Renaissance, banking had already reshaped the world. Wars were funded with loans, cathedrals were built with credit, and trade routes were sustained by networks of finance. Money had moved from being a simple medium of exchange to becoming a force that directed history itself. And in truth, every time you use a credit card, take out a loan, or even borrow a book from a library, you're echoing that ancient innovation, the trust that tomorrow will come and that debts can be repaid. Banking and credit transformed money from static coins into a dynamic force, multiplying possibilities and risks alike. Paper money and the printing revolution. For thousands of years, money meant metal, gold, silver, bronze, copper, stamped, weighed, and carried. But as trade networks expanded and economies grew, coins became impractical. Imagine trying to fund a massive army, build a city, or finance trade caravans across continents with sacks of heavy metal. Something lighter, easier, and more scalable was needed. This is where the next revolution began: paper money. The story starts in China during the Tang dynasty around the 7th century, when merchants began using promissory notes as a substitute for bulky coins. These notes were essentially early checks, pieces of paper that represented stored value. But it was during the Song dynasty in the 11th century that the first true government-issued paper money emerged. Known as jiaozi, these notes were backed by the state and accepted across vast territories. Suddenly, wealth was no longer heavy. It could be folded and carried, traded quickly, and multiplied in ways coins could never achieve. Paper money was more than convenience. It was transformation. It freed economies from the physical limits of precious metals. Gold and silver were finite, locked in mines or plundered from neighbors. Paper, by contrast, could be produced almost endlessly. Though with a dangerous catch, too much printing risked inflation. And indeed, history shows both the brilliance and the fragility of this innovation. In 13th century China, under the Yuan dynasty, paper money became widespread, but reckless overprinting led to runaway inflation, eroding public trust, and destabilizing the economy. The lesson was clear: money, when detached from tangible resources, required discipline and control. The printing revolution later gave paper money new life in Europe. After the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, knowledge spread faster, and so did financial innovations. By the 17th century, countries like Sweden and England were experimenting with banknotes. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, issued standardized notes that became widely accepted. These weren't just paper scraps. They were legal promises backed by governments and central banks. For the first time, states had the power to create money on a scale unimaginable before. Paper money reshaped trade and everyday life. It allowed economies to expand, credit to flourish, and markets to grow. Armies could be financed more easily, infrastructure built faster, and long-distance commerce simplified. Think of the Silk Road. With coins, caravans needed guards, mules, and constant weighing. With paper notes, the same value could slip into a pocket, unlocking the vast expansion of global trade. But paper money also deepened the illusionary nature of wealth. A coin at least had intrinsic value in its metal. A note had value only because people believed it did. In this sense, paper money was pure trust, written on fragile sheets of pulp. It was both liberating and precarious. If trust faltered, the system collapsed. The South Sea Bubble in England or John Law's Mississippi Scheme in France during the 18th century are vivid examples. Overissuance of paper money tied to speculative ventures led to disaster, bankrupting thousands and shaking entire economies. Yet, paper money endured. Why? Because it matched the rhythm of human ambition. Coins could not keep up with the growing scale of trade, cities, and empires. Paper could. It was lighter, faster, and more flexible. It was the financial counterpart of the printing revolution. Just as printed books spread knowledge, printed banknotes spread wealth. Both accelerated civilization. Even today, when we swipe a card or tap a phone, the legacy of that shift remains. Our money is more abstract than ever, floating as digital numbers across screens and servers. But the leap that made this possible was paper money. The bold idea that value could live not in weighty metal, but in fragile paper, stamped with trust. The shift to paper was not just an economic tool, but also a cultural one. It changed how people thought about wealth, risk, and the state itself. Governments became deeply entangled with money supply, shaping political power through monetary control. Wars, revolutions, and empires were won or lost, not just on battlefields, but in the printing houses where money was born. So when you hold a banknote today, realize it carries the echoes of ancient Chinese merchants, European bankers, and countless printers who turned paper into power. That simple slip in your pocket is not just money. It's centuries of trust, invention, and ambition pressed into a fragile sheet that holds civilizations together. The gold standard and the age of stability. By the 19th century, paper money had spread across much of the world, but there was still one nagging question: what gave it value? Coins had intrinsic worth in their metal, but paper was fragile, easy to print, and dangerously vulnerable to inflation. To anchor faith in paper, nations turned to something both ancient and universally admired: gold. Thus began the age of the gold standard. The logic was simple. Every note in circulation could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold held by the government. Gold was rare, durable, and universally valued. Pegging paper money to gold created stability. People trusted that their notes weren't just empty promises. They were backed by a treasure locked in vaults. It was a marriage of old and new, the flexibility of paper tied to the timeless luster of gold. Britain was the first to formalize this system in 1821, and soon other major powers followed. The gold standard became the backbone of global finance, allowing currencies from different countries to be exchanged with confidence. If a French franc was backed by gold and so was a British pound, then merchants could trust in their equivalents. This system fueled the explosion of international trade in the 19th century, enabling railroads, telegraphs, and steamships to stitch together a truly global economy. Gold also acted as a natural governor on reckless money printing. Since the supply of paper currency was tied to a finite amount of gold, governments couldn't simply flood economies with notes. This restraint helped maintain long-term price stability. Inflation was rare, and currencies held steady value across generations. A gold-backed note was as solid as the metal itself, but stability came with costs. The rigidity of the gold standard often clashed with the unpredictable rhythms of economies. When countries faced war, famine, or depression, their ability to respond was limited. If gold reserves ran low, governments couldn't issue more money, even if their citizens desperately needed relief. In times of crisis, the very thing that made gold powerful, i.e. its scarcity, became a shackle. The cracks became visible in the 20th century. World War I forced many nations to abandon the gold standard temporarily as they printed massive amounts of money to fund their war efforts. The interwar years saw attempts to return to gold, but instability and the Great Depression made it untenable. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement created a modified system. The US dollar was pegged to gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. For a time, this created a new era of confidence, with the dollar as the anchor of the global economy. But even this arrangement eventually collapsed. By the 1970s, mounting debts, inflation, and global trade imbalances forced the United States to abandon the gold standard altogether. From then on, money became purely fiat, backed by nothing but government decree and collective trust. Gold was dethroned as the ultimate guarantor. And yet, the allure of gold never disappeared. Even today, central banks hoard it as a hedge against crisis. Investors rush to it during financial turmoil, calling it a safe haven. Culturally, it retains a timeless glow, from wedding jewelry to Olympic medals. Gold embodies permanence, a metal that resists corrosion and symbolizes enduring value. The gold standard was more than an economic system. It was a psychological contract. It reassured societies that money was grounded in something tangible. It gave stability during the great industrial expansions of the 19th century, but its eventual fall revealed a deeper truth. Value, in the end, is not in the metal, the paper, or the coin. It's in the trust that binds us together every time you look at a gold coin or a piece of jewelry. Remember, this is the metal that once held the world's money hostage, shaping wars, trade, and the rise of nations. Gold, for centuries, was not just wealth, it was the very measure of civilization's stability. The birth of modern economics and financial theories. By the 18th and 19th centuries, money had already transformed human civilization. Trade routes stretched across continents, paper currency was spreading, and gold underpinned global confidence. But a new question emerged. How do we truly understand the forces behind wealth, markets, and growth? Out of this question, the modern science of economics was born. The earliest thinkers about wealth weren't economists in the modern sense, but philosophers and moralists. Aristotle pondered the purpose of money and warned about usury. Medieval scholars wrestled with questions of fair pricing and the morality of profit. But it was in the Age of Enlightenment that economics began to take shape as a discipline. In 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, a book that changed history. Smith argued that individuals, by pursuing their own self-interest, unintentionally benefited society as a whole through what he called the invisible hand. This was a radical idea. Markets didn't need constant control from kings or churches. Instead, they could self-organize, guided by the pursuit of profit and efficiency. Smith's ideas laid the foundation for capitalism and free trade, principles that would fuel the industrial revolutions of the 19th century. But Smith was not the only voice. Others wrestled with the darker sides of capitalism. Karl Marx, in the 19th century, warned that unchecked markets would lead to exploitation, inequality, and class conflict. He saw money not as a neutral tool, but as a weapon of power, shaping the relationship between workers and owners. Marx's critiques fueled movements and revolutions, making economics not just a science, but a battleground of ideology. The 20th century brought even more refinement. John Maynard Keynes, responding to the devastation of the Great Depression, argued that markets did not always self-correct. Sometimes they failed catastrophically, leaving millions unemployed and economies shattered. In such cases, he said, governments must step in, spending, investing, and stimulating demand to restart the economic engine. His theories reshaped global policy for decades, giving rise to welfare states and government-backed growth strategies. Meanwhile, another school of thought rose in opposition. Monetarists, led by Milton Friedman, argued that controlling the supply of money itself was the key to stability. For them, inflation was always a monetary phenomenon, and careful regulation of currency could prevent crises. This clash between Keynesian intervention and monetarist restraint defined much of modern economic policy. Beyond these grand theories, economics also borrowed from mathematics, psychology, and physics. Game theory emerged, analyzing how individuals make decisions in strategic situations. Behavioral economics revealed that humans are not the rational calculators classical theory assumed, but are influenced by biases, emotions, and social pressures. Prospect theory, for example, showed that people fear losses more than they value equivalent gains. a quirk that shapes markets every day. Economics, at its heart, became the science of choices, how individuals, businesses and governments allocate scarce resources. Money was no longer just a coin or a note. It was a lens to study behavior, power, and society itself. Through equations, models, and experiments, economists tried to make sense of the tides of history, the boom and bust cycles, and the invisible patterns linking millions of daily transactions. Yet, for all its sophistication, economics remains both powerful and fragile. Predictions fail, bubbles burst, and black swan events, rare, unpredictable crises, overturn models in an instant. The 2008 financial crisis, for instance, blindsided even the best minds. It was a stark reminder that while economics seeks laws like physics, it is ultimately a human science, bound by psychology, trust, and uncertainty. Still, the birth of modern economics gave humanity tools to navigate complexity. It offered ways to measure growth, manage trade, fight poverty, and design systems for stability. It also gave us language, GDP, inflation, supply and demand, terms we now take for granted but which shape policy and everyday life. When you hear about stock markets rising, interest rates changing, or governments debating budgets, you're hearing echoes of Smith, Marx, Keynes, and Friedman. Their ideas live on, embedded in the policies and debates that govern our world. Money may have started as metal and paper, but with economics it became something more, a science of human ambition, fear, and imagination. It is a reminder that wealth is not only numbers in ledgers, but also stories we tell about how the world works. Stories powerful enough to move nations and redefine civilization. Risk, reward, and the psychology of investment. Every decision about money carries a shadow. Risk. To invest is to step into uncertainty, to gamble that the future will unfold in your favor. Without risk, there would be no growth. With too much risk, there is ruin. Understanding this delicate balance is not just economics. It is psychology, biology, even survival instinct. From the earliest merchants setting sail with cargo across stormy seas to modern investors placing trades in milliseconds, humans have always wrestled with the question, how much am I willing to lose for the chance to gain? Science shows that this question is deeply wired into our brains. The limbic system, the emotional core of our mind, lights up at the prospect of reward, flooding us with dopamine. But it also ignites with fear when danger looms. Risk is not abstract, it is felt in our very bodies. Psychologists have found that humans are not neutral when it comes to risk. We are loss-averse. Studies show that losing $100 feels about twice as painful as gaining $100 feels good. This asymmetry shapes markets, bubbles, and crashes. Investors hold on to failing stocks longer than they should, hoping to avoid the sting of loss. Others rush into booming markets, driven by the fear of missing out. FOMO, a modern name for an ancient instinct. Mathematicians tried to tame risk with formulas. Probability theory, pioneered by Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat in the 17th century, began as an attempt to understand gambling. Later, economists extended these ideas into expected value, risk-return ratios, and portfolio diversification. The logic was clear. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Spread your risk, and you reduce the chance of catastrophe. This principle still governs investment today, from individual retirement accounts to massive hedge funds. But risk cannot be fully eliminated. Black swans, rare, unpredictable events, can wipe out even the most carefully balanced portfolios. The financial crisis of 2008, the dot-com bubble, or sudden geopolitical shocks remind us that uncertainty always lurks. The models may give probabilities, but they can't see everything. Cultural attitudes toward risk also shape economies. In some societies, like the mercantile cities of Renaissance Italy or the startup hubs of modern Silicon Valley, risk-taking is celebrated, even romanticized. Failure is seen as a lesson, not a stigma. In others, risk is shunned, with savings prized over speculation. These cultural patterns determine not just personal fortunes, but national trajectories. Nations that embraced risk often surged ahead in trade and innovation, while those that clung to caution sometimes stagnated. Yet risk is not merely a matter of numbers or culture. It is a human experience. Every loan taken, every business started, every invention funded carries uncertainty. Behind every skyscraper, bridge, or company logo lies a story of someone willing to risk failure for the chance of success. Humanity's progress is built on this willingness to leap into the unknown, and it is not just about markets. Risk pervades life. Choosing a career, moving to a new city, even falling in love, all are investments of time, energy, and trust with uncertain outcomes. The science of risk in finance mirrors the science of risk in life. We measure, calculate, and hedge, but we also dream, hope, and sometimes leap without certainty. Modern finance tries to balance this tension. Derivatives, insurance, and hedging instruments are all attempts to cushion risk. But even these safety nets can become traps, creating illusions of security that unravel in crisis. When too many believe risk has been eliminated, markets often fall hardest. In the end, risk is not something to fear or deny. It is the price of possibility. Every reward carries its shadow, every gain its gamble. The psychology of investment is the psychology of being human, balancing fear with hope, logic with emotion, and present pain with future promise. So, the next time you hear about stock markets rising and falling, remember, it isn't just numbers. It's the heartbeat of human psychology, millions of minds weighing fear and desire in real time, turning uncertainty into the story of wealth and loss. Section 8. The fear and greed cycle in markets. If risk is the constant background hum of finance, then fear and greed are the drumbeats that drive it forward and backward in waves. Markets are not ruled by cold equations alone, they pulse with human emotion. Every boom and every bust in history can be traced back to these two primal forces, tugging at investors, traders, and entire societies. Greed is the engine of expansion. It fuels innovation, trade, and investment. When times are good, when markets climb steadily upward, optimism grows contagious. People buy more, borrow more, and believe that the future will continue to reward them. It feels unstoppable. In these moments, financial markets resemble a carnival, full of excitement and the thrill of easy gain. The late 1990s dot-com boom was one such carnival. Companies with no profits, sometimes no products, saw their stocks soar simply because people believed the internet would rewrite everything overnight. But greed has a shadow. As valuations climb higher and higher, reality cannot keep pace with expectations. Eventually cracks appear. A company fails, profits miss, or debt piles too high. Suddenly confidence wavers, fear rushes in. The carnival goes silent. What was once optimism becomes panic, and investors rush to sell, pushing prices down. In a heartbeat, greed turns to fear, and markets collapse under the weight of their own illusions. This cycle is as old as finance itself. Tulip mania in 17th century Holland is often cited as the first speculative bubble. At its height, a single tulip bulb sold for more than a house. People weren't buying flowers, they were buying the dream of infinite profit. But when demand faltered, prices crashed and fortunes vanished overnight. Centuries later, the Great Depression, the housing bubble of the 2000s, and countless smaller crises all followed the same emotional rhythm. Boom fueled by greed, collapse driven by fear. What's remarkable is how predictable these cycles seem in hindsight, yet how difficult they are to stop in real time. Human psychology resists balance. When greed rises, warnings are ignored. When fear takes over, opportunities are missed. Even professional investors fall prey to these forces. Warren Buffett famously summarized it: be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. But few manage to live by it, because in the heat of the moment, emotion drowns out logic. Science has begun to map these rhythms. Neuroscientists have studied traders' brains during booms and busts, finding that dopamine surges during gains mimic the effects of addictive drugs. In other words, the brain literally becomes hooked on winning. During downturns, cortisol, the stress hormone, floods the body, narrowing focus, heightening anxiety, and driving panic selling. Markets may seem abstract, but they are lived viscerally, in hormones and neurons firing inside millions of human beings at once. The fear-greed cycle isn't limited to stock exchanges. It appears in housing markets, in technology adoption, even in everyday life decisions. When people believe an asset, whether it's land, Bitcoin, or rare art, will only rise, greed pushes prices to unsustainable heights. When that belief falters, fear accelerates the fall. The pendulum never stops swinging. It only pauses before the next arc. The key insight is that markets are not perfectly rational. They are human. They breathe, expand, and contract with us. And while models can help us predict probabilities, they cannot extinguish the emotions that drive behavior. Fear and greed are not flaws in the system. They are the system, the invisible hands pushing money across the globe. The next time you see headlines of a soaring market or a crashing one, remember, you are not watching numbers move on a screen. You are watching collective psychology unfold, millions of people carried by hope or gripped by panic, turning raw emotion into economic history. The science of debt, shadows of borrowed wealth debt, is one of humanity's most powerful inventions. On the surface, it seems simple: borrow now, repay later. But beneath that simplicity lies a force that has built empires, toppled nations, and reshaped societies. Debt is both promise and burden, possibility and trap. It is wealth borrowed from the future, a shadow that stretches across time. The origins of debt reach back to the earliest civilizations. In Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago, farmers borrowed seeds or livestock from temple granaries, promising repayment after harvest. These obligations were recorded on clay tablets, some of the earliest financial documents in history. Debt made farming less risky. Even if a bad season struck, the farmer had access to resources to survive. But when too many seasons failed, the same debt turned into bondage, forcing families into servitude. Ancient kings sometimes issued debt jubilees, erasing obligations to prevent collapse. Even then, societies understood that unchecked debt could destroy the very people it was meant to help. At its heart, debt is trust extended across time. A lender believes the borrower will honor their word, and the borrower believes the future will provide enough to repay. This mutual faith is fragile, yet it fuels progress. Without debt, most great projects would never have been built. Cathedrals, railroads, skyscrapers, and entire wars were funded not with coins in hand, but with promises written on paper. Every bridge or factory you see likely began as a debt contract, someone daring to borrow against tomorrow. But debt also has a darker side. It grows quietly, compounding like interest itself until it overwhelms. Households, companies, and nations have all learned this lesson. The Latin root of credit means to believe, but belief can crumble. When debts are too large to repay, crisis follows. History is littered with defaults, bankruptcies, and collapses triggered by overextension. The 2008 financial crisis was, at its core, a story of debt gone wild, mortgages bundled, leveraged, and multiplied until the system buckled under its own weight. Psychology plays a role here too. Debt tempts us because it brings immediate reward at the cost of delayed pain. Our brains, wired for short-term survival, find it easier to focus on the now than the later. Buying on credit gives us the thrill of consumption without the sting of waiting. But when multiplied across millions, this behavior creates economies fueled by obligation, fragile to shocks and downturns. There is also a moral dimension to debt. For centuries, religions and cultures have debated whether charging interest is just or exploitative. Medieval Christianity condemned usury, while Islamic finance still forbids interest-based lending. Others see debt as a necessary engine, a fair price for risk taken by lenders. Both views recognize the same truth: debt is never neutral. It shapes relationships of power between those who have and those who need. On a global scale, debt links nations as tightly as it binds individuals. Developing countries borrow from wealthier ones, betting on growth to repay. Sometimes it works, lifting millions out of poverty. Other times, it traps countries in cycles of dependency, their futures mortgaged to distant creditors. Even wealthy nations juggle towering public debts, sustained only by the belief that tomorrow's growth will outpace today's borrowing. And yet, debt remains indispensable. Without it, few people could own homes, start businesses, or fund education. Without it, nations could not invest in infrastructure or respond to crises. Debt is the oxygen of modern economies. Invisible, necessary, but dangerous when too concentrated. To see debt clearly is to recognize its dual nature. It is possibility written on paper, but also shadow cast across generations. Every time you swipe a credit card or sign a loan, you are participating in this ancient, powerful ritual, borrowing tomorrow to live today. And like all rituals, it carries both hope and risk. Inequality and the 80-20 rule. Why wealth? Concentrates. Look closely at wealth and you'll notice a strange pattern. A small portion of people hold a vast share of resources, while the majority share what remains. This isn't just coincidence or unfair policy. It's a principle so universal it shows up in biology, business, and even physics. It's known as the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 rule. In wealth, it often manifests as 20% of the population owning 80% of the assets. But in reality, the ratio is often more extreme. The richest 1% today control nearly half of global wealth. Why does this happen? The roots lie in mathematics and feedback loops. Wealth tends to attract more wealth, just as gravity pulls objects together. A person with money can invest, earn interest, and multiply their resources. Meanwhile, someone with less often spends all they earn, leaving little to grow. Over generations, these differences compound like interest itself, widening the gap until fortunes seem unbridgeable. This dynamic isn't limited to humans. In ecosystems, a few dominant species often control most resources. In technology, a few companies dominate global markets. In cities, a few neighborhoods capture most of the land value. Nature itself seems biased toward inequality. A few thrive, the many survive. Yet inequality raises profound questions about fairness and sustainability. Economies depend on consumers, but if wealth concentrates too tightly, demand weakens. History shows that extreme inequality often precedes unrest. The French Revolution erupted under crushing aristocratic privilege. The Gilded Age in America, glittering for the few, ended in reform and labor revolts. Today, the widening wealth gap sparks debates over taxation, universal basic income, and redistribution. Technology accelerates inequality in subtle ways. Algorithms amplify success, popular videos get recommended more, best-selling authors dominate shelves, and top companies attract endless investment. Wealth isn't just money, it's visibility, attention, and influence. Once momentum builds, it feeds itself, a snowball rolling downhill. For those at the bottom, the climb grows steeper with each passing year. But inequality is not only economic, it's educational, technological, and even cognitive. Access to knowledge, tools, and networks determines who rises and who stagnates. A child born into privilege may inherit not just money, but connections, health, and confidence. A child born into poverty faces invisible taxes, worse schools, limited healthcare, fewer opportunities. Over time, these invisible differences shape entire societies, cementing inequality before choices are even made. And yet, the story isn't hopeless. The same forces that concentrate wealth can also spread it. Policies like progressive taxation, investments in education, and fair access to technology can bend the curve. History shows nations that find balance, allowing success but preventing crushing disparities, often thrive the longest. When opportunities expand, so does creativity, innovation, and resilience. Perhaps the most haunting truth is that inequality is both natural and dangerous. It arises spontaneously, as predictable as physics. But unchecked, it destabilizes the very systems that create wealth in the first place. To understand inequality is not just to study numbers, but to confront one of civilization's deepest dilemmas: how to balance the drive for prosperity with the need for fairness. The 80-20 rule whispers a paradox. Concentration is inevitable, but collapse is avoidable. Societies must decide whether wealth is a ladder that lifts everyone, or a pyramid where most remain at the bottom, supporting the few at the top. The psychology of money. Why we think irrationally about wealth money is not just numbers on a screen or paper in your wallet. It is emotion, memory, and survival instinct tangled together. Psychologists often remind us that we do not think rationally about wealth. Instead, we fear loss more than we celebrate gain. We chase trends we don't understand, and we make choices today that quietly sabotage our future. One of the most powerful biases is loss aversion. Losing $100 feels far worse than gaining $100 feels good. This shapes our behavior everywhere, from pulling out of investments too early to refusing risks that could bring long-term growth. Our ancestors evolved to avoid threats more urgently than they sought rewards. That instinct, once useful in the wild, now distorts decisions in the modern economy. Then comes the lottery effect. Across cultures, millions spend money on lottery tickets with odds smaller than being struck by lightning. Why? Because our minds overestimate tiny probabilities. The dream of sudden wealth shines brighter than the logic of compound interest. Casinos, stock markets, and even speculative bubbles exploit this bias, promising fortune while delivering ruin to most. Another hidden influence is social comparison. We rarely measure wealth in absolute terms. We measure it against our neighbors. A person earning $70,000 a year may feel rich in one community, but poor in another where peers earn double. This comparison trap fuels dissatisfaction even when needs are met. Social media intensifies this effect, constantly broadcasting curated images of luxury, success, and abundance. Humans also struggle with time discounting, the tendency to value today over tomorrow. Saving for retirement feels abstract when the reward is decades away, while spending on pleasures now delivers immediate satisfaction. This bias explains why so many fail to invest consistently, despite knowing the math. We are wired for short-term survival, not long-term planning. Fear and greed are the twin engines of financial markets. When markets rise, greed blinds us, convincing us that trends will never end. When markets fall, fear freezes us, pushing us to sell at the worst possible moment. This cycle repeats endlessly. Bubbles inflate, bubbles burst, not because of numbers, but because of human psychology. Yet awareness of these biases can free us. Investors who learn to expect loss aversion, who commit to saving automatically, who focus on long-term goals rather than daily fluctuations, can overcome the mind's traps. The secret is not superhuman intelligence, but discipline. In finance, the calm mind outperforms the clever one. But psychology of money is not only individual. Nations and markets behave irrationally too. Whole economies chase growth at the expense of sustainability. Governments borrow endlessly to satisfy voters today, ignoring future generations. Herd behavior drives collective decisions just as it does individual ones. In the end, money is less about mathematics than about behavior. Wealth grows not only from earnings, but from habits, patience, restraint, curiosity, and humility. To master money is to master oneself. The science of finance is numbers, but the art of finance is psychology. And if we can recognize our irrational patterns, perhaps we can reshape them into something wiser. The paradox remains: humans built money as a tool, but in many ways, money now controls us. To reclaim control, we must first understand how our own minds deceive us, and how awareness can turn weakness into strength. The future of money. From barter to Bitcoin and beyond, imagine. Stepping back thousands of years, when money did not exist, people traded directly. Grain for cattle, tools for cloth, salt for fish. Barter was simple, but it was also fragile. What if the fisherman wanted grain, but the farmer didn't want fish? Human progress demanded something better. The first leap came with commodity money, objects that carried value on their own, like gold, silver, or salt. Gold shone not only because of its luster, but because it was rare, durable, and divisible. For centuries, it defined wealth across civilizations. Then came coins and paper, symbols backed by rulers and empires, easier to carry than sacks of metal. Slowly, trust shifted from objects to systems. In the modern age, fiat money emerged. Unlike gold, paper notes had no intrinsic value, but they carried authority. A dollar was worth a dollar because governments and societies agreed it was. The real power was trust. As long as people believed in the system held. But today, we live in another turning point. Digital money has become the dominant form, invisible numbers on screens replacing tangible bills. Paychecks arrive electronically, transactions move through banks at the speed of light, and credit itself becomes a currency. Money has grown lighter, faster, more abstract. And then came the most radical shift yet: cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, launched in 2009, offered a vision of money without governments, banks, or central authority. It ran on blockchain, a distributed ledger maintained not by rulers but by networks of computers. For the first time, money could exist without borders, without intermediaries, purely as code. Some hail it as liberation, others as speculation. But one fact is clear: cryptocurrency challenges the very definition of money. If people trust it, if they use it, then it becomes money in practice, even without physical form. Yet its volatility also reveals a truth. Money is only as strong as the belief behind it. Beyond crypto lies central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, digital dollars, euros or yuan issued directly by governments. These could blend the speed of crypto with the stability of national backing. But they also raise questions. How much control should states have over private transactions? How much privacy should individuals expect when every digital coin can be traced? Looking ahead, the future of money may stretch even further. Some envision economies run by energy-backed tokens, where electricity or renewable power becomes the unit of trade. Others imagine AI-managed currencies, adjusting supply in real time to stabilize markets. Some futurists even propose interplanetary currencies, systems that could work across Mars and Earth, accounting for the delay of light between planets. Yet in every era, the pattern remains. Money evolves to match the needs of society. It shifts from physical to abstract, from heavy to weightless, from local to global. What remains constant is the human belief that these symbols matter. So what is the future of money? Perhaps it will be cashless societies, blockchain economies, or currencies tied to resources we have yet to master. But at its heart, money will always be a mirror, reflecting our values, our fears, our trust, and our collective imagination. When archaeologists of the far future study us, they may not just find coins or notes. They may uncover digital ledgers, cryptographic keys, or fragments of blockchain networks. And they will know that in this era, humanity once again redefined what it meant to trade, to trust, and to value. The story of money is not finished. In fact, it may only be beginning. Inequality and wealth gaps. Why money isn't shared evenly Money is universal, but its distribution has never been equal. In every society, from ancient kingdoms to modern economies, wealth pools in some hands while slipping away from others. Why? The answer lies in history, structure, and human behavior. Consider the Pareto principle, often called the 80-20 rule. In economics, it means that roughly 20% of people control 80% of the wealth. This pattern has appeared repeatedly across time, from Roman landowners to today's billionaires. It isn't a law of nature, but it reflects how systems of advantage reinforce themselves. Once wealth accumulates, it tends to attract more wealth. One engine of inequality is capital versus labor. Those who own assets, land, factories, stocks, businesses, see their wealth grow through profits and compounding. Those who work for wages see growth only as fast as salaries rise, often lagging behind inflation. Over decades, the gap between owners and workers widens, even if both work equally hard. Another driver is access to opportunity. Education, healthcare, safe housing, and technology are not distributed evenly. A child born into poverty may never access the same networks, schools, or investments as one born into wealth. The starting line is not the same, and over generations this compounds into lasting inequality. Globalization also plays a role. On one hand, it has lifted millions from poverty, especially in developing nations. On the other, it has concentrated immense wealth in multinational corporations and individuals who can operate across borders. While many workers remain tied to local wages, technology amplifies these divides. The rise of AI, automation, and digital platforms creates immense fortunes for innovators and early adopters, but it can also erase traditional jobs and leave millions behind. We stand on the edge of a world where machines generate wealth, but humans must still find purpose and survival within it. Yet inequality is not just economic. It is psychological. Humans compare themselves constantly. Even in societies where basic needs are met, the sight of others having more creates resentment, envy, and unrest. Wealth gaps are not only about survival, they are about status and perceived fairness. Can inequality be solved? History suggests it can be reduced, though not erased. Progressive taxation, public education, and social safety nets have all lessened divides in different eras. Policies like universal healthcare or wealth redistribution aim to rebalance opportunities. But each solution sparks debate. How much should societies reward success? And how much should they guarantee equality? Some thinkers propose radical futures. Ideas like universal basic income, UBI, suggest giving every citizen a regular payment, no strings attached, to ensure a baseline of dignity. Others suggest wealth taxes on billionaires to redistribute resources more fairly. Critics argue these approaches risk discouraging ambition or driving capital away. Supporters argue they are the only way to prevent a collapse under inequality's weight. Science and finance intersect here. Studies of inequality show it isn't just unfair, it's unhealthy. Societies with extreme wealth gaps often see higher crime, poorer health outcomes, and weaker trust between citizens. Inequality doesn't just affect the poor, it corrodes the stability of the entire system. And yet, inequality persists because it is self-reinforcing. The wealthy can influence laws, policies, and narratives that protect their position. Meanwhile, those at the bottom face barriers to breaking out. Like gravity, wealth attracts more wealth, pulling opportunity toward itself. But here is the paradox. While inequality is ancient, it is not unchangeable. Societies have reshaped their rules before, abolishing serfdom, industrializing education, creating middle classes where none existed. The future of inequality depends not just on economics, but on choices made collectively. In the end, the wealth gap is a mirror. It reflects how societies balance ambition and fairness, freedom and security, reward and solidarity. And whether those balances shift toward harmony or fracture depends on whether we see inequality as destiny or as a challenge still within our power to change. Inflation and deflation. The hidden forces shaping our daily lives. Roomy price tag you see at the store tells a story. A loaf of bread costs more this year than last. A movie ticket that was a few dollars decades ago now eats into a wallet. This invisible current of rising or falling prices is inflation and deflation, forces that quietly shape our lives, our savings, and even the fate of entire nations. Inflation is when money loses value over time. A dollar today buys less tomorrow. Some inflation is natural and even healthy. It encourages spending and investment rather than hoarding cash. But when inflation surges too high, life becomes unstable. People rush to buy goods before prices rise again, savings erode, and wages struggle to keep up. History offers striking examples. In Weimar Germany of the 1920s, inflation became hyperinflation. Workers carried wages home in wheelbarrows, only to find bread prices had doubled by evening. In more recent times, countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela have endured similar crises, where national currencies collapsed under runaway inflation. But there's also the quieter, less dramatic inflation we live with daily. The cup of coffee that costs a little more each year. The rent that creeps higher. Over a lifetime, these small increases can feel enormous. Someone who retires with savings must always ask, will my money last if prices keep climbing? Deflation, on the other hand, seems like it should be good news. Prices falling instead of rising. But deflation can be dangerous. When people expect prices to keep dropping, they delay spending. Why buy today if it will be cheaper tomorrow? That hesitation slows economic activity. Businesses cut wages or jobs, and the cycle deepens. Japan experienced this lost decade of deflation in the 1990s, where growth stagnated for years. So why do inflation and deflation happen? The answers lie in supply, demand, and money itself. Too much money chasing too few goods creates inflation. Think of a gold rush where everyone has pockets full of nuggets, but only a few shops to spend them in. Prices soar. Conversely, when demand dries up, when consumers stop buying and businesses stop investing, prices sink. Central banks like the Federal Reserve in the US or the European Central Bank are the guardians against these extremes. They use tools like interest rates to balance the economy. Lowering rates encourages borrowing and spending, raising them cools things down. Their goal is to keep inflation steady at around 2%, a rate that allows for growth without chaos. But inflation isn't just numbers on charts. It's deeply personal. It affects whether you can afford rent, whether your paycheck feels enough, and whether retirement feels secure. A 3% rise in grocery prices doesn't sound alarming, but over years, it snowballs. Suddenly, budgets stretch thinner and choices grow harder. Some inflation today is driven by global events. Wars, pandemics, supply chain shocks. They all ripple into everyday prices. When oil prices spike, transportation costs rise, and suddenly everything from food to furniture costs more. In a connected world, no economy is fully insulated. Technology also plays a surprising role. Automation and digital platforms sometimes act as deflationary forces, lowering costs of production and goods. Think of how smartphones replace cameras, calculators, and music players, delivering more for less. Yet, at the same time, digital monopolies can push prices higher in other areas, capturing markets and limiting competition. For investors, inflation and deflation shape strategy. Gold is seen as a hedge against inflation, a safe harbor when paper money feels unstable. Stocks may rise with inflation if companies can pass higher costs to consumers. Bonds, on the other hand, lose value when inflation eats into their fixed payments. Every decision about saving or investing must account for the silent tug of prices. On a psychological level, inflation erodes trust. When people no longer believe money holds its value, societies falter. Hyperinflation often precedes political collapse, revolutions, and social unrest. Stable money, by contrast, builds confidence. It lets people plan, save, and dream. The paradox is that both inflation and deflation are dangerous at the extremes. Too much of one burns an economy, too much of the other freezes it. Somewhere in the middle lies balance, a slow and steady rise in prices that keeps economies moving forward without tipping them into panic. So next time you notice the price of coffee has crept up, remember, it isn't just about beans and milk. It's about the unseen dance of money, trust, and policy that ties every wallet in the world together. Inflation and deflation are not distant concepts from economics textbooks. They are the pulse of daily life, shaping how far each dollar carries us, how secure our future feels, and how societies rise or stumble. Debt and credit. The double-edged sword of modern economies. Debt and credit are two sides of the same coin, tools that have built civilizations and destroyed them. At their core, they are about trust. Trust that money borrowed today will be repaid tomorrow. But behind this simple idea lies a complex machinery that powers modern economies while also threatening them with collapse. Credit is what allows businesses to expand, families to buy homes, and students to pursue education. A farmer who borrows to buy seed is betting on the future harvest. An entrepreneur who takes a loan is wagering on tomorrow's profits. Without credit, progress would crawl. Roads, bridges, and innovations would remain dreams, yet every promise of repayment carries risk. Debt piles up when optimism outpaces reality. When too many people, companies, or governments borrow more than they can repay, the system shakes. The 2008 financial crisis was a stark reminder. Easy credit fueled a housing bubble. Mortgages were handed out carelessly, bundled into complex securities, and sold across the world. When homeowners defaulted, the entire financial system trembled, showing how fragile trust can be. But debt is not just a modern problem. Ancient societies wrestled with it too. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded debts and repayments. When debts became unbearable, rulers sometimes declared jubilees, wiping the slate clean to prevent social unrest. Even in ancient Rome, cycles of debt and default sparked political upheaval. On a personal level, debt can be liberating or crushing. A student loan may open doors to careers that would otherwise be closed. A mortgage provides shelter but also ties decades of income to a bank. Credit cards offer convenience but can spiral into traps of high interest. For many, debt is a constant companion, shaping decisions about work, family, and dreams. Governments, too, walk the tightrope of debt. National debt funds wars, infrastructure, and welfare. It allows countries to invest in the future, but also exposes them to collapse if it grows too heavy. History remembers nations that drowned in debt, Spain after its empire's decline, or Greece during the Eurozone crisis. Yet it also shows how countries like the United States rely on debt as a foundation, with US Treasury bonds considered among the safest assets in the world. Why does credit matter so much? Because it multiplies economic activity. A single dollar deposited in a bank can be lent out, spent, deposited again, and lent once more. This is the principle of fractional reserve banking, where money expands far beyond its original form. It fuels growth but also amplifies risk. Debt also carries a psychological weight. The idea of owing can shape behavior. Some feel motivated, pushing harder to meet obligations. Others feel crushed, paralyzed by the weight of repayment. Entire generations have been defined by debt burdens, from the Great Depression to today's student loan crisis. On the global stage, credit weaves nations together. Countries lend and borrow across borders, creating webs of financial interdependence. When one nation defaults, the shockwaves ripple worldwide. Argentina's debt crises, for example, have sent tremors through international markets multiple times in the past century. But there is also an ethical dimension. Should hospitals, schools, or even nations be allowed to collapse under debt? Should debts always be repaid, no matter the human cost? Economists debate whether debt forgiveness can reset economies and provide fresh starts, or whether it encourages reckless borrowing. At its best, Debt is a ladder, lifting people and societies higher. At its worst, it is a chain binding generations to repayment. The double edge of this sword is sharp. It cuts forward into opportunity and backward into ruin. In today's world, we are more indebted than ever. Global debt now exceeds $300 trillion, far more than the value of all goods and services produced in a year. This staggering figure shows how deeply credit runs through our lives. We are all tied to it, whether through mortgages, student loans, government bonds, or corporate borrowing. The paradox of debt and credit is that economies cannot function without them, but they are also never free of their dangers. Every boom carries seeds of a bust. Every promise to repay carries a shadow of default. And yet, without them, progress halts. Debt and credit remind us that the future is always uncertain. They are bets on tomorrow, written into today's contracts. Some pay off, some collapse. And in that fragile space between promise and reality lies the story of economies, families, and entire civilizations. Inequality and wealth distribution. Why the gap keeps growing? We live in a world of astonishing wealth. Skyscrapers glittering in financial districts, fortunes made overnight in technology, trillions flowing through global markets. Yet at the same time, billions struggle to afford food, housing, or healthcare. This stark contrast and the gap between rich and poor is not new, but in today's world it has reached levels unseen since the days of ancient empires. Inequality is not just about numbers, it is about opportunity. Imagine two children born on the same day. One is born into a wealthy household with access to the best schools, networks, and safety nets. The other is born into poverty, where every meal is uncertain and education is a fragile hope. Though they begin life on the same planet, their futures diverge almost instantly. History shows us that inequality is a constant undercurrent in human societies. Ancient Egypt, Rome, and medieval kingdoms all had rigid hierarchies where wealth was concentrated at the top. Peasants, laborers, and slaves sustained elites who lived in luxury. Revolts, revolutions, and reforms often erupted when the gap grew unbearable. In the modern age, inequality takes on new forms. Globalization has lifted millions out of extreme poverty, especially in Asia. Yet, it has also concentrated wealth in the hands of a few corporations and individuals. The world's richest 1% now owns more than half of all global wealth. The names of billionaires dominate headlines, their fortunes sometimes larger than the GDP of entire nations. Why does the gap keep growing? Part of the answer lies in how money itself grows. Wealth generates more wealth. Investments earn returns. Assets like real estate or stocks appreciate over time. Those who start with resources can ride this wave upward, while those without struggle to catch up. It is the compounding effect, like interest on savings magnified across generations. Technology accelerates this divide. Innovations create enormous rewards for those who control them. The founders of major tech companies have built empires within decades, while millions of workers see wages stagnate. Automation threatens jobs in manufacturing, retail, and even services, further widening the divide between those who own technology and those displaced by it. Education, too, acts as both bridge and barrier. Higher education opens doors to better jobs, yet the cost of schooling creates barriers for many. Debt becomes the price of opportunity, and in some cases the burden outweighs the benefits. Inequality is reinforced when access to education, healthcare, and even stable housing is uneven. On a global scale, inequality between nations is also profound. Wealthy countries dominate trade, finance, and innovation. Developing nations often remain dependent on exporting raw materials while importing expensive technologies. The playing field is tilted, and historical legacies of colonization and exploitation still echo in today's economic structures. But inequality is not only economic, it is also psychological and social. Vast gaps in wealth can corrode trust, weaken communities, and fuel resentment. When people feel the system is rigged against them, societies fracture. History shows that extreme inequality often precedes unrest, from the fall of the French monarchy to protests in modern democracies. Yet inequality is not inevitable. Policies matter. Tax systems, minimum wages, social safety nets, and access to healthcare and education can either narrow or widen the divide. Countries like the Nordic nations have shown that it is possible to balance capitalism with fairness, creating societies that are prosperous yet more equal. The danger is that when inequality grows unchecked, it undermines democracy itself. When wealth buys influence, the voices of ordinary people fade. When opportunities shrink, cynicism grows. The dream of upward mobility, that hard work leads to success, begins to feel like an illusion. And yet, inequality is also a mirror. It reflects the choices societies make about fairness, opportunity, and human dignity. Every time a government sets a tax rate, every time a company decides on wages, every time individuals make decisions about giving, investing, or hoarding wealth, the gap shifts, however slightly. The story of inequality is not only about billionaires and the poor, it is about everyone in between, the middle classes stretched thin, the workers balancing on uncertain ground, the families trying to hold on to dignity in a system that often feels tilted against them. The question that lingers is this: will societies allow the gap to keep widening, or will they choose to bridge it? The answer may determine not only economic futures, but the stability of entire nations. Wealth inequality is not just an economic problem. It is a moral one. The psychology of money. Why we think the way we do about wealth money is not just numbers on a screen or paper in a wallet. It is emotion, memory, and perception wrapped into one. Our relationship with money is shaped not only by economics but by psychology. Why do some people save obsessively while others spend recklessly? Why do markets sometimes behave irrationally, driven by fear or greed? The answers lie in how our minds interpret value, risk, and reward. Consider how we treat a sudden windfall versus hard-earned wages. Studies show that people are more likely to spend lottery winnings frivolously but guard their paycheck carefully. Logically, money should be money, but our brains assign meaning to its source. Behavioral economists call this mental accounting, the way we separate money into categories that don't truly exist. Risk is another powerful factor. Humans are notoriously poor at assessing it. We may fear losing $100 far more than we celebrate gaining the same amount. This is called loss aversion. The pain of loss outweighs the joy of gain. In investing, this leads people to sell in panic when markets dip and hesitate to buy back in when prices recover, often locking in losses. Our upbringing also leaves lasting imprints. Children raised in scarcity often grow into adults who hoard money or fear risk. Those raised in abundance may view money as endlessly replenishable. Culture plays a role too. Some societies prize saving and frugality, while others emphasize status and consumption. These cultural scripts influence everything from personal spending to national saving rates. Money also taps into deeper psychological needs. A luxury car is not just transportation. It is a signal of status. A large house may be less about shelter and more about identity. Advertising exploits these instincts, linking products to aspirations, belonging, and self-worth. In this way, money becomes a mirror of what people value most, even if those values are subconscious. Markets themselves are reflections of collective psychology. The stock market often rises and falls not purely on data, but on emotion. Fear of missing out, herd mentality, and overconfidence drive bubbles and crashes. The dot-com bubble of the late 1990s showed how enthusiasm for new technology inflated values far beyond reality, only for fear to pop the bubble later. But psychology also explains why money brings diminishing returns to happiness. Studies suggest that beyond a certain income threshold, more money adds little to life satisfaction. Once basic needs and a degree of comfort are met, Additional wealth often shifts focus to comparison. Happiness becomes relative, measured against neighbors, co-workers, or celebrities. This status treadmill ensures that no amount feels enough. Debt psychology is equally revealing. Borrowing may relieve immediate pressure, but brings long-term stress. Credit cards, with their ease of use, detach spending from the physical act of parting with cash. People spend more when paying with plastic because the pain of loss feels less immediate. Payday loans and predatory credit prey on this psychological vulnerability, offering quick relief at devastating long-term cost. On the other hand, saving often requires overriding instinct. Humans are wired to prioritize the present over the future, a concept known as present bias. It's why retirement accounts are underfunded, why diets fail, and why procrastination thrives. Governments and employers design systems like automatic enrollment in savings plans to bypass this bias and help people secure futures they might otherwise neglect. Trust also plays a crucial role. Money itself is built on trust. Trust that paper bills or digital numbers hold value tomorrow. When trust erodes, as in times of hyperinflation or banking collapse, psychology shifts quickly from calm to panic. Runs on banks happen not because everyone suddenly needs cash, but because no one trusts the system to provide it. At the personal level, money psychology often blends rational calculation with irrational impulses. Some people chase get-rich-quick schemes despite knowing the odds. Others avoid investment altogether, clinging to savings accounts that lose value to inflation. Both extremes stem not from logic, but from fear, hope, and the deeply human desire for security. Ultimately, understanding the psychology of money means seeing it as more than currency. It is a lens through which we view safety, status, opportunity, and self-worth. Our choices around it are less about math and more about meaning. The paradox is that money feels like a tool of reason, yet it is one of the most emotional aspects of human life. To master it requires not just learning economics, but also understanding ourselves. For in the end, the wealth that matters most may not be what we hold in our accounts, but in how clearly we see the forces within us that drive our decisions. The science of markets, pattern, chaos, and the search for predictability markets look like chaos at first glance. Numbers flashing, prices rising and falling, fortunes made and lost in minutes. Yet beneath the noise, patterns emerge, subtle rhythms that economists, scientists, and even physicists have tried to decode. The stock market is not just about money. It is about complexity, psychology, and the deep question of whether human systems can ever be predicted. One way to see markets is through the lens of supply and demand. When demand for a product rises, prices follow. When supply overwhelms demand, prices fall. This basic dance explains much of economic movement, but it cannot explain sudden panics, bubbles, or crashes. Those moments are less about rational equations and more about human behavior en masse. Enter the idea of market cycles. Investors often speak of booms and busts, expansions and contractions, as if markets breathe in and out. The tulip mania of the 1600s is a famous early example. Tulip bulbs in the Netherlands became so valuable they sold for the price of houses, until the bubble burst and values collapsed overnight. The same cycle repeated in the dot-com bubble of the 1990s and the housing bubble of the 2000s. Different eras, same human impulses. Physicists have even studied markets with the same tools used for weather and chaos theory. They see stock prices as resembling turbulent systems, sensitive to small changes, impossible to predict perfectly, but governed by probabilities and patterns. This gave rise to the efficient market hypothesis, which argues that all known information is already priced in, making it impossible to consistently beat the market. And yet, legendary investors like Warren Buffett seem to do just that, suggesting markets are not entirely efficient. Another striking aspect is the power law distribution. A few companies dominate while most remain small. A few investors make extraordinary gains while most see average returns. This echoes patterns in nature. A few earthquakes cause massive destruction, while countless small tremors go unnoticed. Markets, like nature, cluster outcomes unevenly. Technology has added a new layer of complexity. Algorithmic trading now accounts for much of the volume in modern exchanges. These are not human decisions but machine reactions, executing thousands of trades in milliseconds. When algorithms interact, they sometimes create flash crashes, sudden plunges in market value with no human trigger, revealing how fragile the system can be when speed outpaces understanding. Markets are also influenced by collective psychology. Fear and greed ripple through like waves. Optimism inflates bubbles. Panic bursts them. Economists call this herd behavior. Individuals mimicking the crowd, believing safety lies in numbers. Yet in markets, the crowd can be disastrously wrong. Still, markets are not purely chaos. Over long stretches, they reflect human progress. Despite wars, recessions, and crises, the overall trajectory of stock markets has been upward, echoing growth in productivity, technology, and global wealth. This long view offers a paradox: short-term unpredictability paired with long-term reliability. The science of markets also highlights how information spreads. News, rumors, and data travel instantly today, shaping prices before most people can react. This creates volatility but also transparency. Markets react to everything from political events to weather patterns, sometimes in exaggerated ways. For ordinary people, the lesson is humility. No model, however advanced, can fully capture human behavior under stress. The smartest investors know not how to predict the market perfectly, but how to manage risk, diversify, and resist emotional swings. Markets may resemble chaos, but within the chaos lies opportunity for those who remain patient. In the end, markets reflect us. They are not machines operating independently, but human systems amplified by technology. They embody our hopes for growth, our fears of loss, and our endless search for certainty in an uncertain world. Whether patterns can ever fully be tamed is doubtful, but the search itself, the attempt to find order in apparent disorder, is what makes the science of markets endlessly fascinating. The value of trust, why economies collapse without it strip money down to its essence, and you will find not metal, paper, or code, but trust. A bill is just ink on cotton. A digital transaction is only a string of numbers. Their power comes from collective belief, the agreement that others will accept them tomorrow. Without trust, economies unravel no matter how advanced their systems or how vast their wealth. History provides stark reminders. In ancient Lydia, where some of the first coins were minted, currency succeeded because people trusted the stamp of the king. When rulers debased coins with cheaper metals, trust faltered and commerce shrank. Centuries later, in Weimar Germany, hyperinflation shattered trust so completely that workers demanded wages twice a day before prices could rise. Currency became worthless, not because of its material, but because faith in it collapsed. Trust extends far beyond money. Banks exist because depositors believe they can withdraw funds at will. If everyone loses that trust simultaneously, even the strongest bank falls. A bank run. Stock markets function because investors trust companies to report honestly, regulators to oversee fairly, and others to keep buying and selling. Break that chain of trust, and panic spreads faster than any virus. Even governments rest on trust. National debts are sustainable not because they can always be repaid immediately, but because investors believe they will be honored in the future. When countries default, it is usually a crisis of confidence, not numbers. Investors flee, interest rates spike, and economies collapse under the weight of vanished trust. Technology, too, is built on faith. Digital payments, cryptocurrencies, and online banking all depend on invisible code. For most users, understanding blockchain or encryption is impossible. They trust systems because they work consistently. until one failure shakes confidence. Hacks, fraud, or outages can spread doubt instantly, showing how fragile belief can be in digital worlds. Trust is also deeply psychological. Humans evolved in tribes where survival depended on cooperation. Money and markets scale that instinct to billions of strangers, connecting people who will never meet. When you swipe a card in a distant country, you are extending trust across borders and cultures, relying on systems built by countless unseen hands. But trust, once lost, is hard to restore. Consider corporate scandals like Enron or financial disasters like 2008. These moments did more than cost money. They corroded public confidence. Laws, regulations, and reforms can help, but the scars remain. People withdraw, hesitate, and grow skeptical. Economies recover on paper, but trust lingers in shadow. At the same time, trust can be astonishingly resilient. Even after wars, depressions, or crises, faith in money and trade often returns. People still need to exchange, invest, and dream. New currencies replace old ones, banks reopen, and markets revive. Trust can be rebuilt, slowly, painfully, but inevitably, because without it, human society cannot function. The paradox of trust is that it is invisible yet more valuable than gold. It cannot be minted, mined, or programmed, yet it underpins every transaction and every economy. Without trust, money is paper, markets are games, and governments are empty words. With trust, even the most abstract systems flourish. So the next time you hold a coin, swipe a card, or check a balance, remember, what you are really holding is belief. Trust is the currency of currencies, the silent glue of economies, the unseen engine of civilization itself. The future of wealth, from scarcity to abundance. For most of human history, wealth has been defined by scarcity. Grain stored for winter, gold mined from the earth, oil drawn from deep wells. The more limited something was, the more value it carried. But we stand at a possible turning point. Technology, science, and imagination raise a question humanity has never faced before. What if the future of wealth lies not in scarcity, but in abundance? Already we see glimpses of this shift. Information once locked in books or guarded by elites is now nearly free. The internet delivers vast libraries, courses, and conversations to anyone with a connection. Knowledge once scarce has become abundant. The same may soon be true of energy, resources, and even health. Consider the dream of renewable energy. The sun delivers more power to Earth in a single hour than all humans consume in a year. If technology can capture and store even a fraction efficiently, energy scarcity could vanish. Economies built on competition for fuel could transform into systems of abundance, reshaping geopolitics and prosperity. Advances in artificial intelligence and automation point in the same direction. Machines already perform tasks once requiring armies of workers. As AI matures, it could produce goods, manage logistics, and even create new forms of value at near zero marginal cost. Scarcity of labor could shift into abundance of productivity. Biotechnology offers another frontier. Imagine food grown not in fields but in labs, eliminating famine. Imagine organs printed with 3D bioprinters, ending transplant shortages. Imagine diseases eradicated through genetic engineering. These possibilities could make what was once scarce, health, longevity, survival, more accessible than ever. Yet abundance brings paradoxes. If energy, food, and information become plentiful, what happens to wealth? Will money still matter when basic needs are free? Or will new scarcities arise? Attention, creativity, identity. History suggests that even as old scarcities vanish, new ones appear. In a world of endless information, focus becomes scarce. In a world of mass production, uniqueness gains value. There is also the danger of inequality in abundance. Technology may create plenty, but who controls it? If a handful of corporations own the infrastructure of renewable energy, AI, or biotechnology, then abundance becomes concentrated wealth, reinforcing the very inequalities it promised to erase. The future of wealth will depend on how societies distribute these tools. Some futurists speak of a post-scarcity economy where automation and abundance make work optional. People could pursue art, science, or leisure without fear of survival. Others warn of a dystopia where abundance exists, but access is restricted, creating even sharper divides. The same tools that could free humanity could also entrench control. Science fiction often imagines these futures, from Star Trek's replicators to AI-managed utopias. But science fact is catching up. Renewable energy costs plunge, lab-grown food is entering markets, AI generates ideas and art, and medical revolutions are accelerating. The seeds of abundance are already sprouting. The ultimate question is not whether abundance is possible, but whether humanity can adapt. Our systems, money, politics, culture, are built on scarcity. They may struggle to evolve when scarcity is no longer the defining principle. The future of wealth may demand new ways of thinking about fairness, purpose, and what it means to live well when survival is no longer the challenge. Perhaps the truest wealth of the future will not be money at all, but time. Time to think, to create, to connect. Time no longer spent in relentless struggle for survival, but in exploration of what it means to be human in a world of plenty. The journey from scarcity to abundance is not guaranteed. It could collapse under inequality, exploitation, or misuse. But if navigated wisely, it could mark the greatest shift in human history. Wealth may no longer be a matter of who has more, but of how we choose to share what is already enough. And in that vision, the story of money, and from barter to Bitcoin, from scarcity to abundance, becomes not just economics, but a meditation on humanity's future.